Right, I think we're live and streaming now. Is that right, Fiona?
Not quite yet. If you can just hang on a wee bit longer. It's just it's switching over to YouTube now, and I will be able to confirm.
I have a message saying that we're live on YouTube.
Yeah.
Right. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin. My apologies, first of all, for a late start to this meeting. A number of members and officers, indeed, are having difficulty joining us. I've waited now 17 minutes. I think we are quorate, and therefore I will start the meeting, albeit without all of our members. Welcome to this Zoom meeting of the Value for Money Scrutiny Committee. We have with us at the moment myself, Councillor Peter Martin, I'm the chairman. We have Joan Hegan with us, the vice chairman. We have Stephen Mulliner and Jerome Davidson and Julia Potts. I think that's the members we've got at the moment. We are hoping others will join us. We have with us various senior officers. You can see them by name. And I think that we're joined by several members of the executive, namely Mark Merriweather, Anne-Marie Rosamond, David Beeman, Paul Follows, and John Ward. So welcome to you all. I would ask members if to use the hand raise function within Zoom. I think most of us are now pretty familiar with the protocol. Could I also request that we have a limit of 4 minutes on people to speak, but I would hope that we would have, make those contributions rather less than 4 minutes and not have speeches, but have more in the way of questions and observations. We have one exempt part of this meeting. If we look at agenda item 6, which is the contingency revised budget, there is a section in pink paper, which means it's exempt or confidential, and that's exempt Annex 5. Which is page 27. It is concerning the leisure side of the budget. I do propose that we will conclude this meeting in its open format and then go into exempt session at the end of the meeting in order that we can deal with that fairly significant item within the revised budget. I hope that that is clear. Has anybody any questions as to process? Okay, let's proceed then. Firstly, minutes of the last meeting, agenda item 1, which is page 7. Can I take those as approved as the minutes of the last meeting? Is that accepted? Okay, I think Jerry Hyman, you've now joined us by phone. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, hello, yep.
Okay, thank you. Sorry that you've had difficulty, Jerry. We've just
I've been locked out.
Okay, yes, one or two others have as well.
I'm sorry, I missed something there about pink papers, I think. That,
no, what I've said is that we will be having an exempt session to discuss the leisure part of the budget meeting, which is on page 27 of our papers. So I will be letting that go into exempt because I think there's little point in doing it in any other way.
Fair, okay, agreed.
Okay, so agenda item 1, the minutes we just said we were happy with those, so let's now proceed to apologies for absence. I haven't really got an apology. I've got a matter of George Hess, who has resigned from this committee, and we weren't able to get a replacement in, a substitute in for him. But anyway, we thank him for his prior service on this committee, and doubtless there'll be a new addition to our ranks very soon. Declaration of interest. I've received no interest declaration prior to this meeting. Has anybody got any interest they wish to declare? Okay, I will take that as a no. Move on to item 4, which is questions from the public. Kimberly, have we any questions from the public?
No, Chairman, no questions submitted. Okay,
thank you very much. Then let's move on to item 5, which is questions from members. Councillor Mulliner has asked 4 questions. The answers are before us. Might I propose, Stephen, that we delay the answers on that and any questions you want to bring up until we're into the next session, the next agenda item, because they all refer. Does that make sense?
Yes, happy with that, Chairman.
Okay, fine. So let's move on then to item 6, remembering that we need to come back and cover those questions from Stephen Mulliner and the answers from Peter Vickers. Now, I know that all of us, bar me, were at the member briefing last Monday night, finance member briefing. So we do have an overall understanding, and all of us, I think, have a copy of the slides that were used in that meeting. And certainly I have had a good look at those. So I think together with the report to this meeting, we have a fairly clear idea. But I think Graham, if he's now with us, welcome Graham, is going to just introduce this, and then Mark can continue that introduction. If we can keep that relatively short, and then we can get down to the meatier items of members' questions. So Graham, if I might turn it over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I just check that you can hear me? Because can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
I can hear you very well, yes.
Perfect, good. Sorry, because I've had to rustle together another laptop because I couldn't get in. Apologies for being late on. Okay, thank you, Chairman. Yes, very quickly, and just walking through the budget report. As you say, members were in the briefing last week, so I don't need to do a long introduction, but you know, clearly there are some difficult decisions to take for Waverley in the light of the impact on the budget. All of the things are set out in the annexes. One thing we did refer to in this report was the fact that the government announced just before this report went to press some further funding. We still haven't had the detail of that. So as we sit here this evening, we don't know for sure that we will get further grants, and if we do, how much it will be. It certainly looks positive from looking at the scheme that the government published Thursday before last, but the team have done some calculations, and it will go probably nowhere near to closing the gap. So even if we do get that funding, we are still talking about a very significant gap in our budget that we need to close. But for the purpose of this evening, Chairman, this report stands because we don't have any further clarity on that grant. So members are asked to look at this detail and make comments and observations that will assist with the next round of the democratic process, which is the executive on the 28th of July, and then the council early in August, where we will need to set a contingency revised budget for the current year, because the size of the numbers here are way beyond the delegations under the normal adjustments that we're able to make when budgets stray during the year. Chairman, I'm sort of conscious I'm late on and the time constraints, so I think I'll cut my introduction leave my introduction at that, and then hand over to Councillor Merriweather to look at the numbers, and then we're here to answer questions that members may have on any of the detail. Thank you, Chairman.
Graham, thank you very much indeed. So can we then go to Councillor Merriweather? Mark, would you like to take us through what you want to do with us? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I recognise that we went through this last week, and that you've had a chance to look at the report and the slides from last week. But I'm very conscious that this is the first time that this is being discussed in detail publicly. So I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity just to talk through anyone who's watching the issues that we face, particularly as they might not necessarily have the papers in front of them. I will give a very abbreviated version of what we discussed last week, but I do think it's important that anyone who wants to take the trouble to follow this is given this opportunity, so thank you. So very, very quickly, we are talking about our general fund. We're not talking about our housing revenue account. That's discussed separately in Graham's report. The general fund is everything that we do outside of our social housing. And I'll talk in two separate parts, one about the in-year budget gap that we face for this year, 2021, and then at the end, the consequences beyond 2021 and for our medium financial plan. The point here also being that we are 4 months into by far the most significant financial challenge this council's faced since it was formed. We are still determining what the unknowns are in terms of the problems that we face, and also the unknowns in terms of the support that the government is going to give us to help see us through. And everything that I talk about in the next few minutes is subject to change, uncertainty, and possible adverse movement. Right, the size of the problem. And now this is covered in your papers if you've got them at Annex 1. But to summarize, we estimate now that the impact of C19 on us this year, 2021, will be of the order of about £6.6 million. The largest single impact on us, we believe at the moment, is on our leisure centre and facilities income, which we'll discuss in the exempt session around Annex 5. Our car parking income has been very adversely affected. Different to leisure centres, the leisure centres were closed by law. The car parking income, well, the car parks emptied out pretty quickly after lockdown. We waived charges, but frankly, there weren't any cars in there to charge anyway. But we've made some assumptions here about car parking income. It's way too early at the moment to figure if those assumptions about how it will recover are accurate. The indications are at the moment that for the first week or 10 days, the car parks were back online about a third below where they were this time last year. And our assumption is in July, for the time being, that they will recover to roughly about 50% in July and then ramp up again towards the end of the year. Again, there are lots of assumptions in there which we hope will be on or close to expectation. Property income, our property portfolio not only hasn't performed, we still have some vacancies, but also our targets for the growth in property income this year, we do not expect to be met, and we will revisit that as part of our property investment strategy in due course. The good news is that of our tenancies, our commercial tenancies at the moment, they seem to be broadly holding pretty firm. That's a reflection of who our tenants are and what they do. But we have been giving some comfort to our community tenants who really have been hit hard, and we've been trying to do what we can to protect them. Even though planning stayed open as best it could for as well as it could during the period, we expect about £600,000 of lost income in that regard. And then other costs and loss of income is a mixture of things. They're all identified at the bottom of the table on Annex 1. But for example, we did incur some additional costs for our staff who were all hands on deck manning, for example, the revenues and housing benefits helplines. So what did we do when this all kicked off? Well, we did an immediate review of budget by senior management team to identify further savings. Further is underlined there simply because, if you'll recall, in February, our budget was already extremely tight. We were budgeting cost savings of nearly £1 million, as well as additional revenues of about £0.9 million. So we were already in a position where we were looking to run a very tight ship. We've reviewed projects and capital expenditure. We have initiated a recruitment freeze, and we've initiated a freeze on all non-essential spending. Now, we still have, as Graham mentioned, some uncertainty, and we still need some clarity on government plans. We have received £1.3 million from the two rounds of funding the government announced a couple of months ago, but we do not yet know what the benefit will be from the most recent announcement about 10 days ago. There are other mechanisms for the government to help us outside of grants. We are already pushing for a fairer formulae on our retained business rates, where we currently only keep 5p in the pound of everything we collect from our businesses. We are fighting for a fairer treatment on our business rate revaluation risk. I'll come to that later on when we talk about reserves. And there are other mechanisms that the government could use to assist us. And we've finally taken a look at our reserves, the adequacy of the reserves, the impact of changing those reserves will have on us in years going forward, and whether we can, for the time being, if not permanently, review the adequacy of the reserves while maintaining financial resilience. So what have we come up with? To cover the 6.6 million, as I said, we've received 1.3 million in government grants, with more possibly to follow. But until we know exactly what that is, we have to plan for the contingency that it may not cover everything that we need. As I said, we have, on top of the February budget, earmarked additional vacancy savings, staff vacancy savings from the hiring freeze, £0.6 million. And we've identified £0.7 million of additional other expenditure reductions. We have reversed reserve and capital contributions that we were planning to make this year in our budget of £1 million. And that has left us still with a gap of £3 million that we have taken from our reserves, which pre-existed this year. All of those items are detailed for you with the reports pack at Annex 2. So to put that into the format that we normally use for our budget, when we do the budget in February, this is how it looks. We were originally planning this year for a total service cost of £10.8 million. The gross impact of C19 on that is £6.6 million, which, to put it in context, is 63% of our annual council tax take. But the mitigating cost savings that we've identified are in total 1.3 million pounds, which means that our contingency budget for this year is 16.2 million pounds. Now, we were originally this year looking to move just shy of 2.3 million pounds to our reserves, and we have reversed out of that 982, that's the £1 million of what we were planning to put in. And then this column here identifies where we have found the £3 million in reserves to cover us off for this year. Finally, down at the bottom, finance by, and this is the £1.3 million here of government grants that we've got in. Now, the important thing there to mention, of course, is that particularly with regard to reserves, there is a reason for having these reserves. All of them were absolutely justified and warranted at the time they were set up. And even though we've been able to review them this year, that is still an extremely painful exercise, because it affects our ability to do things in future years, whether it's invest in maintenance, whether it's invest in properties, and it is not without its risks. So I just want to caution everybody that even though we might be able to, or we are able to balance the books this year, that is an extremely painful and nasty process that we will be feeling for some considerable time. So moving forward, our medium-term financial plan, we were already predicting pre-COVID a 5.4 million annual shortfall by 2023-24, and that is a challenge that the council's been working on since 2017 with the budget strategy working group. And of course, COVID makes that much worse. We have not only the immediate unknowns that are inside of our control, but also unknowns that are outside of our control, and particularly in terms of our longer term prospects. We have the economic impact, both nationally and locally, and particularly for the property sector, where we were hoping to mitigate some of the annual shortfall in our budget through a property investment strategy. Socially, the unknowns are we expect there to be an increase in demand on social services, particularly by the vulnerable who are adversely impacted. And we do not know whether the charitable and voluntary sector has the ability and capacity to meet that demand, and the extent to which we will be expected to step in. And finally, political, as I've said, there's uncertainties for us at the moment, just in terms of the immediate support that we're going to be getting from central government. There's uncertainty over the environment for local government funding generally. And of course, we'll all have read in the press, there's even uncertainty over what's going to happen to local government generally. So there we are, Chairman, thank you very much. I hope that was quick enough. And I will now hand it back to Graham and to Peter to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I know that we've now been joined by Councillor Roger Blishen. Roger, are you there? Can you hear us? We'll wait for Roger. And Peter Nicholson, you joined us. I understand he was trying. Okay, Roger, are you able to hear us? Okay, he hasn't figured out how to reply. Oh, hopefully he can hear us still, right? Jerome, have you any news of Peter?
No, he's going to try audio. It looks like Councillor Roger Blishen is on mute. Can someone unmute him?
I think he has to unmute himself. But anyway, let's hope that he's with us. I just wanted to say, Roger, if you are able to hear us, the leisure centre part of this. Roger, you're there. You can hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, Roger, thank you. We're good to have you. Just wanted to say that the leisure centre part of this discussion, we are going to save until the end of the meeting when we will go into exempt session. So please do not discuss the leisure part of this right now. Right. I hope that's
understood.
Okay. Now, before we go into questions generally, Stephen, you had some questions. Kimberly, did you circulate to members of the committee, Roger, the questions from Stephen Mulliner?
I did, Chairman.
Okay, so hopefully you've got those in front of you. Have you got the answers from Peter in front of you as well? I'm presuming that you have.
You should have, yes. I sent the whole thing to everybody.
Fine. Okay, I've certainly got it. I wanted to make sure it has. So, Stephen, your opportunity to come back with any additional questions if you wish to.
Can I check that everyone received Peter's second reply to me?
I know nothing of any questions or answers.
Okay, well, very briefly, the questions were three. First, just to find out which were the most important reserves in terms of benefiting from any additional government funding or suffering if we had additional costs. Peter did respond a second time and referred to the Investment Advisory Board Reserve and the Business Rates Equalisation Reserve as holding those particular roles. My second question was to inquire about the rebuilding rate of reserves, and that gave rise to an interesting answer in that it's clear that with the exception of the general fund working balance of 3.2 billion, which is regarded as a very important minimum level for safe operation, the other reserves are frankly discretionary and subject purely to judgment as to what we think that we need. If Peter thinks I'm getting it wrong, please will he comment afterwards. And my third question was just to gain reassurance that the most difficult part of this, when everything is uncertain, is how soon we will be able to have a picture of next year's budget. Normally, you would not think of working on it from really or properly from October, and you wouldn't expect to have anything definite until December or January. I was keen to know whether that was going to be accelerated given the unusual conditions, and I've been told that in fact there should be a fairly real budget based on the best information at the time by October, which is about 2 months early. So those were my main questions. I'm happy with the answers, but if Peter thinks I've misrepresented him in any way, perhaps he will comment.
Okay, Peter Vickers, do you want to comment any further?
No, Stephen's accurate in what he's saying. The earmark reserves are, as he says, discretionary. We tend to put money aside for specific reasons. It's either risks or projects or some kind of expenditure we're expecting to incur that we need to put some money aside for. It's entirely at the council's discretion as to which reserves we put in place. The budget, as Stephen says, so the basis of the budget, we've literally done a huge piece of work, which is now in front of you. That will now carry on right through the medium-term strategy, and the next few months will be the telling bit about the assumptions of how quickly our income streams are going to recover or not recover over the next, certainly over the next 6 months, but also indications of what the medium term is going to start to look like around the economic factors to do with COVID. So that's pretty much the answers in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. Whilst we're on the subject of reserves, could I just ask maybe Graham in particular as to any concerns he may have as to the adequacy and the level of our contingencies and reserves? If we were comfortable with the level of reserves that we had 6 months ago, presumably we're not so comfortable now. And I see that the intention is that if and when we get further funding from the government, that funding will go back into the reserves rather than doing anything else. Do I understand that correctly?
Chairman, thank you. Yes, that is the intention. I mean, clearly, Chairman, everything in this report is for discussion. That is the proposal that is put forward as an approach, so that when we do get an announcement from government, our first action would be to replenish reserves, because coming back to your first question, as I've set out at sort of 420 and 421 in the report, it's clearly this whole report is a balance of difficult decisions against a backcloth of risk, and I feel, as your 151 officer, that it's a good solution to a difficult problem, in that just over half of the solution is coming from reserves and half from elsewhere. And clearly, it's always better to go forward for the reasons that Peter's just said, with feeling more comfortable about your coverage of risks. But just to pick one specific out, which is the business rates equalisation reserve. This is a reserve that Waverley has been prudently providing for since the whole local government funding for business rates changed back in 2013, and recognising that there were new risks coming for local authorities. Waverley built some mitigation into its base budget, and not all councils did that. They either chose not to, or they just weren't able to find that headroom in their budget. There are a whole number of risks that are sort of covered in there that transferred to local authorities from government 7 years ago now, and what's being proposed in this report, I think, is sensible. It doesn't expose us to a sort of imprudent or unreasonable level of risk. But clearly, it does propose a reduction of the amount that we had set aside. But these are very difficult risks to quantify, actually, because it's about trying to look ahead at things that are largely out of our control. So where the government are going with fair funding review and its review of business rate funding, what will happen with Waverley's entire rateable value base in the future, and indeed what happens with appeals that our businesses submit to the government's valuation office for a reduction in their rateable value. So all of those risks transferred to local authorities a few years ago, and we've prudently set some money aside, but very, very difficult to sort of pinpoint whether it's excessive or whether it's
Okay.
level.
I think we've got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me throw that
Chairman,
now.
Chairman, I've got Councillor Hegan and Councillor Merriweather both indicating to speak.
Okay, fine. Thank you. I was going to throw it open now to members. So let's have Councillor Hegan first. And by the way, just before you start, Joan, I think we've got Peter Nicholson with us now. Can you say yes, Peter, if you're with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much. Sorry you've had difficulties joining us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And firstly, I'd like to congratulate everyone involved for the huge amount of detail that's been very well consolidated into this report. As a very broad concept, I approve the direction of travel in terms of trying to flex reserves rather than take knee-jerk reactions that might have long-term consequences on our service delivery. My only two observations are I would like to see more focus on building up income, and as the example of the garden waste collections, it's a small number, but I think it's important that we are seen to use every opportunity to maximise income before we make harsher decisions. And my other concern was to do with effectively the lack of transparency about the risk assessments behind the reserve allocations. I don't know if as scrutiny we're going to see more of that as we move forward, both through the building of the medium-term plan or indeed approving this particular allocation of reserve releases, because I understand the difference between the not putting the money into reserves and taking from reserves that constrain our ability to do some of the things we'd otherwise have wanted to do and now can't. But there are other reserves, and I maybe cite in combination $750,000 on insurance reserves. Maybe we should see more of the thinking behind why we're not taking some of that. But overall, I think it's a really good balance to not be attacking services too quickly.
Okay, thank you. Whilst we're on the subject of reserves, is there any other member who wants to ask a question relating to reserves, the lack of, the desirability for more, or anything to do with the reserve side?
Yes, I would speak about that. So,
okay.
Councillor
Jerry, do you want to ask a quick question then?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, we have, I see that taken some money from the SANG reserve.
Right.
And I'm really asking, why are we not removing all of the SANG reserve there? There's no requirement that we provide SANGs. Nothing in law says that we have to provide SANGs to developers, and that's fact. And there's no evidence that SANGs are effective. That's fact. The evidence brought forward in 2015 to try and satisfy my questioning was shredded, as Councillor Isherwood, who was there as our representative at the JSBB meeting, can attest, because it would do their case more harm than good. And that was the reason they put in the minutes. And so I see no reason why we shouldn't use all of that if we are looking for money. We can do that. Whether we want to or not is another matter, but obviously it is affected by the other legal issues.
Yep, we've got that. We've got that, Jerry. Yeah.
Another question really is not under this heading, so I'll ask.
Fine. Well, hang on for that. Okay, any other members on reserves before I go to Graham? And I think also Mark was indicating you want to come back in as well. Is that right? Do I get a nod of the head? So let's go back to Graham first, and then maybe Mark quickly. So Graham?
Just very briefly on the SANG point, yes, and I think in the autumn when we look at the overall reserves and the medium term, we should absolutely review that, particularly as we now have SIL in place as well. So yeah, I think it's fine for tonight what we're proposing, but let's have another look, and that covers, I think, Councillor Higgins' point as well about insurance reserves and other things. We'll pick all of that up in the autumn with the medium term view. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, fine, thank you. Mark, did you want to come back on this subject as well?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just 3.5 points really, or something like that. In terms of the reserves, at the risk of being a bit of a party pooper, if you like, not all reserves, just because they're discretionary, are at our complete whim. Some which are grants are ring fenced, and we are restricted or regulated on what we can use them for. Not all of them, of course, but there are some. So we have to proceed there with caution. On the reserves, otherwise, the alternatives aren't simply binary to either spend or not spend the money. Where possible, we've looked at those reserves where we can use alternative sources of funding. So, for example, on capital projects, we do have the option to borrow to invest in capital projects. But the unintended and the nasty consequence of that is that not only do we pay interest on the borrowing, but we pay our MRP on the borrowing. So it's there is a consequence, and it is painful. On the income side of things, I'm grateful to Councillor Hegan for pointing out Annex 3, and just to reiterate that those are things that haven't been forgotten about. They are work streams that are very much in progress, but for various reasons, including timing, we didn't feel that we could bank them, if you like, for the 2021 budget, but they are very much alive and under consideration for next year and the years going forward. I'd also like to close, I know you're pressed for time, Chairman, I'd also like to close by expressing my gratitude and admiration, I think, on behalf of us all, to the team for doing such a cracking job under the most extraordinary circumstances in a fabulous amount of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we'd all agree with that. So just if I can conclude at this point on the reserves, I think first of all, Jerry makes a very interesting point on SANGs and their need for any reserve, which is, I think, then a recommendation from the committee, if everyone's happy with that, certainly for a reconsideration. I think also we would generally support the idea that we need to build the reserves back up again with monies coming from the government, in any increased funding coming from the government. That would be a pretty high priority for members of this committee. Would that be a reasonable agreement as well? So I think 2 specific points then on the reserves.
Chairman,
sorry, who's speaking?
I was hoping to have one more contribution on this.
Oh, on the reserves. Sorry, Stephen. Okay, fine. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that if one goes back to basics, we're confronted with a certain amount of estimated deficit, and your only options are, I believe, to cut costs effectively, draw on reserves, or you can borrow. But as Councillor Merriweather pointed out, that comes at a cost. So unsurprisingly, given that we had reasonably healthy reserves, subject to some constraints like homelessness, we've obviously taken the sensible option. But I am, of course, as you would expect, if we don't have as big a deficit because there's more government assistance, then obviously the draw on reserves will be less, rather than perhaps rowing back on some of the cost savings. I think that is correct, isn't it? That if we do get additional income or from the government, or our income losses are less than we expect, all those benefits will be ploughed back into rebuilding reserves, or at least drawing down less upon reserves than currently indicated. Can I be sure that is the case?
The report says that. Graham, do you want to just make that clear?
That is the intention, Chairman. Yes, yeah.
Okay, fine. So I think that the general feeling from the committee, Graham, Mark, is that we would support the building of reserves as a pretty high priority, and I think a level of concern from the committee about the reduction in the reserves. Of course, we understand why, but I think that's a significant concern. Okay, so let's.
Absolutely, Chairman. If Councillor Hyman here, could I just follow on from what Councillor Mulliner, I think it was, has just said there,
Yeah.
and that is to really a wider question of to what extent should we? I think these papers say that it's this is not a sustainable solution, the use of reserves, and that's fairly obvious. And if this is just the start of more and more deeper financial problems in the future, which we don't really know the extent to which it is at this point, then should we be proposing what is effectively a long-term unsustainable solution at the moment? So that really is a much wider question for the committee as to whether or not we think we should be even though it's would appear to be the best solution right now, and I agree with Councillor Mulliner in that respect. Should we actually be considering this, the use of reserves, as a short-term solution? Because but perhaps we will look back upon it and think, no, actually, we should have taken other action sooner. And that I think is a more important argument, really, we should be having.
Yep. So the question, therefore, is should we have gone more for cuts and then less in reserves? Graham or Mark, do you want to make a reply on that?
I'm happy to, Chairman. At the risk of repeating something I said some time ago, you can only cut once, and it tends to be it tends to have a permanence about it, which can also drive unintended consequences. So I think I thoroughly agree with the sentiments that everyone's expressed here, that the going to reserves here is anything but the suggestion of a permanent solution. It's absolutely quite the opposite. But one of our guiding lights here has been to do no harm, to do no permanent harm, to do no permanent damage, and allow the government time to fulfill its promises to us, and allow us the time to make proper, well thought through decisions based on the situation as it emerges. Be ready to do more if it gets worse, and be very grateful if it doesn't.
Okay, thank you. And Graham, did you want to add to that very quickly?
Well, just very quickly, Jim, just to also remember that we are continuing with our transformation efficiency projects alongside all of this work as well. So there are already things in train that are continuing. So whilst this is a short-term fix for this year, we're already reducing our cost base and trying to drive income up. And Kelvin will touch on some of that under the next item. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Could I just then, as you've now touched on that, could I ask a question from the chair, which is in the budget that we approved only a few months ago in full council, there were £699,000 worth of savings, which the heads of the services were expected to save, and there were some £100,000 of transformation savings. There's no mention of that in this whole revised budget. Do I make the assumption that those savings that were proposed then are still safe to assume now, and that COVID-19 has not impacted that?
Peter, would you mind, because you've done all the detailed work with service managers, would you mind just coming back on that?
Yeah, certainly. So, Chairman, I circulated an answer to that a little bit early today, and so the answer is that there was 698,000 went into the budget as savings. By the time we entered the new financial year, 557,000 had already been literally secured. So there wasn't a huge gap to be at risk through COVID. And as things stand at the moment, the cost base, including those savings, isn't showing stress in the way the income is. So we're fairly secure on the cost side. It's the income that's the key issue for us, which plays through the numbers. So we have turned over all the stones. We've really tested what's going on in the services over the last 8 weeks or so. We are confident that the cost base is fairly secure in what we've looked at.
I appreciate that, and I would recommend again from the chair that when you go to the report to the executive, you might want to make the comparison or make us understand what the the good things that are still happening in the budget that you've been able to hold on to. It might be worth adding that in to the report for the executive. Councillor Gray, I know that you have a question that you would like to put. Would you like to put that question to us now?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of this has been answered, but my basic comment was, I know we're not the end of COVID, but I am disappointed that there's not more detail on the options. We've gone through and we're quite happy that we've balanced the loss of income, increased costs with the adjustments there, but we know that we're going to have to come along and look at this again. I couldn't see the link between that question and the answers in the next agenda item. So I'm saying, are we happy with what we've put up, that we don't have more in the way of options we haven't addressed? I think Councillor Hegan basically pointed out that there are some things in the options there, but not very many. I would have expected a lot more, at least £1 million potentially, showing there's where we're going to get the next £1 million from. That's basically my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a fair point. Members might want to turn to Annex 3, page 25, which discusses options and alternative mitigation. Of course, it's always a dream in a committee of this sort that we might discover something that nobody's ever thought of. So further alternatives or options. And maybe the SANGS was near enough that from Jerry. But are there any other questions that people would like to ask concerning the additional options? The green waste subscription fee to be increased possibly as a further alternative. There's a question about the Better Care Fund, which we could reinterpret and maybe be able to utilise grant balances and therefore reduce the toll on the general budget. There's grass verge cutting, which we perhaps could reduce. Grounds maintenance, temporary contract reduction, and there's service level agreements with some community organisations. I don't know whether anybody has any questions or whether anybody's wanting to make a comment as to whether they feel some of those ought to be done or explored further or are desirable.
Well, yes, Councillor Hyman here. Yes, I would say that for all of those should have been considered over the past 3 months anyway. Have they not? To what extent have they been considered already by officers as part of their preparations? And why aren't we doing them if they're easily doable?
Yeah. Well, I don't think they're easily doable, but they are potential. They're not in the revised budget, but we'll ask that question of Graham in a second. Stephen Mulliner, you have a question here?
Thank you. Yes, I was not clear whether the largest item, 319,000 for grounds maintenance temporary contract reduction, is really in the same class as the others. It sounds as though it would be a one-off, unless one planned to continue that, obviously. Whereas increasing the green waste fee, you could see being a sustainable increase in income. Okay,
so if I can say then, could we get an answer then on how much £85,000 would mean for extra charges for each resident? Could you give us a bit more on the Better Care Fund? It does seem to me that looks to be a very sensible way of raising money or saving money in the general account. And then we've got a specific question on the £319,000 on grounds maintenance, temporary contract reduction, unless any other members wants to make a point before I go to the officers. No, let's go to Graham or Peter or Mark. Then.
Yes. Hello. Hello,
Peter.
Peter. Yes, just a very quick one. I was looking at this. I think the least worst option is the modifying the grass cutting schedule. I think it would help biodiversity. I think it would be quite popular. And I think that might be worthwhile to add as a financial contribution. Okay, well, let's go back to Graham or Peter on that.
But Chairman, maybe I can start just generally around the options. I mean, in paragraph 4.9 of the report, the last sentence, what we're saying is here, we haven't included them in the revised budget put forward, but we are still looking at them. One of the considerations was how quickly could we realise a saving. And So so they're still here in the papers, and I think if members express a view that they should be considered, I'm sure that Councillor Merriweather and the executive will consider those comments coming through from the OPM Scrutiny Committee. On the individual items, I believe the green waste £85 extra revenue is generated by a £5 per subscription increase. Rosie's nodding, so I'm taking that as I've got that right. The Better Care Fund, yeah, this is one that we'd need a little bit longer to look at, but it does throw up some potential opportunity for using these funds slightly differently going forward. I won't go into too much detail in this meeting because it's not in the proposals, unless you want me to, or members ask any questions, Chair. But it's not something we can sort of switch on immediately. It's definitely something that Peter's review will be looking at for the medium term. We've got Calvin here, so in terms of grass cutting and grounds, I wonder if I could just ask Calvin for a view, because again, I understand that this would require some negotiation with the contractor, and that might take a bit longer. And but Calvin, can I just ask Chairman for Calvin for a comment on those specific...
Calvin, yes, very happy for Calvin to comment. Calvin.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Graham. Yeah, that's correct. The ground maintenance savings would require negotiations with Continental Landscapes to reduce their specification. So a meeting has been set up. The reason for not including it within the savings is that does require them to agree as part of the negotiation. And in addition, we only have just retendered we only retendered last November, so it's quite a significant change to the contract, and it will only be for 1 year, so it's a one-off saving if we could achieve it.
Okay, thank you. So it would seem to me, Graham, that I personally would be quite keen on looking at the Better Care Fund. It seems to me a technical thing and a bit of a reinterpretation exercise, and that's something which I would have thought that we ought to be looking at. We haven't gone into it in detail, but I did have a discussion with Graham about this afternoon. I would strongly recommend that that is looked at. I hope members of the committee might be in agreement with that. And then the other question, I guess, is for us all to sort of say, what do we think about the desirability of putting up the green waste subscription? When was it last put up to £70?
I'm not sure. I'm just looking at Rosie, actually. Is it 2 years ago, Rosie, or 3?
I believe it was last year, so not this February recently. So it would have been February 2018. It would have last gone up, and it went up £5.
Okay, so what do members think about raising money by pushing the green waste subscription fee up?
I think given the extra time in the garden, people would probably understand why, and it would be a permanent increase, which would be valid for that reason. And I'm glad to hear that the grounds maintenance idea really has no legs at all, because it would be a one-off and it would mean redundancies, which is a daft way of behaving. So yes, I would support an increase in the green waste fee.
Others, will other members support that?
Chairman, do we know anything about wasn't this asked at the budget meeting, Councillor Hyman here, but price elasticity of the fees for green waste collection? Because we can't be sure that we will get there's 100% elasticity. We can just put the price up as much as we want, and it'll have no effect on the number of people.
Graham, do you want to comment on the elasticity of this?
I'm not sure. Annie, did you have your hand up or not? Because I can answer it, but I'll hand over to
Annie.
Annie.
Sorry, I didn't see Annie. Annie?
Evening, everyone. I was just going to say that on previous reviews of the price and in previous authorities, it doesn't actually seem to make much difference when you put the price up. You still get an uptake, and particularly in Waverley, with so many people with large gardens, we've got plenty of people who've got multiple subscriptions.
All right. Well, I think it's probably on balance, the committee probably feels it's worth some serious consideration. And although I think few of us will be desperately keen on that, and it sounds as if you're already onto the grass verge cutting and grounds maintenance contract reduction, Kelvin, in as much as you can do something. But Stephen's expressed some concern as to whether this just is a one-off and whether it's right to be making redundancies and so on and so forth. I think that's probably a reasonable comment. That we really don't want to do something which we then 6 months later or 12 months later are deeply regretting. So I would urge caution in that area. And similarly, I would have thought service level agreements with community organisations might be an area which the committee may not be too happy about. What do others feel about that?
Myself, Chairman, sorry, I can't put my hand up because I'm on the phone.
No, that's
so,
right, that's fine.
So I unfortunately have to interrupt. But yeah, I'd support you in looking at the Better Care Fund. You obviously know more about that than I do, and we've been told constantly when I've asked that nothing's off the table. So let's look at it and see what the impacts would be, because obviously we've got to, that's the most important thing, is what the impacts are on the residents and whether they would support us in it. And we expect our residents to be quite supportive if we're doing the right thing by them. So I don't see that there should be any problem with looking at things and seeing how much money can be saved.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, this is difficult. I mean, to some extent, the question I suppose that I really ought to be asking is, or we ought to be asking is, do we have to make this decision now? Do we have to take this decision now, or is there a requirement? I mean, obviously, there's the Section 114, isn't it? That's if councils are in serious trouble, but by when do we have to have an alternative budget in place? Can we wait to see what the government are going to do before we show our hand, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good general question. I'm happy to debate that in a second, Jerry. But let's just stick with these options for the moment, and then we'll come on to that. Joe,
can you just check, Chairman, in that case that we have back to the grass cutting and the grounds maintenance. Continental were given the contract, as someone reminded us not long ago. They were given the contract, and do they do the grass cutting as well? I'm not sure that they do.
Okay, well, I think...
sorry, the verge cutting. They do the grass cutting. Do they do the verges along the roads that we do, I think, paid by Surrey?
Okay,
which I think
we'll ask for an answer on that. I'm just going to touch base with Joan. I think you've got your hand up, Joan.
I did, but I put my hand up when you moved on to community organisations.
Right.
I mean, I think this is going to be a very complex area, but I think we can certainly assert that it's a good time to be looking at the right balance of payments to voluntary organisations. I think it links very closely, though, to the next item on the agenda. I gather there's some SWOT analysis being done, and I was going to raise the question there as to whether we know any of the outcome of that, because I think we do need to flex this budget, but cautiously, because it's a very complex process once we start tinkering with it. And I think it cuts across as well to the community wellbeing O&S. So I'm really not sure how far this committee should be looking at that.
Okay, so we've got some reservations about service level agreements, although you're saying perhaps we should be looking at that. Stephen, did you want to say anything? Then I've got Annie as well.
Yes, Joan has actually said part of what I wanted to say. I think if it was clear that one could simply recognise that these organisations were receiving government funding, and we could basically use that as an indirect form of funding for ourselves, and it wasn't going to harm them, then that would make sense, and that would be a purely temporary action, clearly. But I do agree that keeping an eye on the SLAs is something which we should be doing all the time. But I agree that working with the bodies who are benefited by it tends to be quite a slow process.
Okay. Thank you, Annie, and then I'll come to Graham to wrap up on this bit of the consideration. Annie?
Thank you. As part of the community overview and scrutiny, they are actually looking at the residents' needs assessment. So they're looking at what residents need going forward. I mean, there's a whole group of people now who are quite nervous about going out, who would have used those community services. People who've lost confidence in the services, because they don't want to be, say, on a bus or in a day centre with those people because of the close proximity. So there's a review of the services going forward. We also need to look at the service level agreements, and particularly people who furloughed staff, as to whether we're giving additional grant when they've already had grant from furloughing. So I think we need to bear that one in mind as well.
Thank
it is
you.
a slow job, but there are some potential issues there.
Okay, thank you. That's something which I haven't thought of, and I think that's a very reasonable point, that we should be looking at that and ensuring they're not benefiting from a double count. Graham, do you want to just come back to us finally in this section? We've given you, I think, a steer as to, yes, perhaps to green waste subscription fees going up, yes to the Better Care Fund, yes, perhaps to the grass verge cutting, but we don't want to see any actions which we might regret in 6 or 12 months' time, and then some consideration of the service level agreements. Does that seem to make sense to you? Have you got any other comment?
Chairman, thank you for that. No, that was a very good discussion on the options, and they were put in for that reason, so that our members could discuss them either as part of this package or for the future, because as the report says, you know, our financial challenges don't go away once we've realigned this year. In fact, you know, we're likely to enter a period as a country in a region of you know, very difficult economic times, and that we know that in itself impacts on us. So we need to keep on coming forward with ideas of efficiency and new ways of raising income.
Okay.
I just mentioned Councillor Hyman's point around the timing. Do you want me to cover that off now?
Well, yes, but just before we come to that, I just want to cut off then on the options. I'm now closing on the option section and any contribution we have to suggest additional items. So if we can open the matter up a little more, and Graham, let me come back to you in a second with Jerry's very good point about when we need to do something. Could I open up then the discussion more generally to members now concerning the paper and concerning the cost cuts that are envisaged and whether we need to do it and by when, and then maybe we can take a group of questions and come back to Graham. Are there any questions that people have more generally on the report that we haven't considered yet? Whilst people are thinking, maybe I could just ask one. In section 4.17 on page, whatever it is, I've lost my page numbers now, page 18. You mention that there's an 80,000 of the government grant of 1.3 that you intend to give over to the parishes and the towns. I don't see any mention of that in Annex 2 or any definition as to where that comes from. Could you help me with that?
Chairman, let me help there. So in Annex, so in the cost annex, we'll just call it up so I can talk about. So in Annex 1, there's the 80,000 near the bottom, and it's been labelled grants for shielding rough sleepers, etc. That there is actually the I've mislabeled it when I pulled this together. I did copy and paste from the COVID bit down below. So we've got the additional grant in Annex 2 of 80 grand, but the actual expenditure being incurred in that was just covered through business as usual within the homeless service. And that service was being covered. If you look on the reserves, on Annex 4, the very top line, it says flexible homeless support grant, planned use in 2021. They'd already taken account of it there. So effectively it's covered.
Okay, so it's there, but it's not very clear. So I guess, again, you might want to make that more clear for the executive report so that towns and parishes are able to identify that. And then we'll come to Jerry's question about when we need to do this and why we need to do it now. But are there any other more general points that people want to ask that I can then get Graham to sum up on? Peter, was that saying you wanted to do something? Peter Nicholson?
No, I'm quite happy with what I've heard so far.
Okay,
Thanks.
fine, thank you. So then let's come to the question of Jerry as to why we need to do this now. When's the latest we need to take decisions? Can we delay? Graham?
Chairman, so the extent of the projected budget shortfall and the sudden nature of this coming to light means that urgent action is needed, and for the main reason being we need as much of the financial year in order to implement savings that will have that effect of helping us close the budget. We have to, as I've set out in the early part of the report, set and then maintain a balanced budget as a local authority by law. There's no specific definition of that, and that's down to local judgment by the Section 151 officer, and indeed working with portfolio holder and councillors. So it's the maintaining, and we know now that our forecasts are for a significant budget shortfall, so a shortfall of income that won't meet our expenditure. So we cannot carry on paying contractors, staff and our bills if we know that we won't have enough income over the financial year to do so. And normally we can make these adjustments through our scheme environment, etc. These numbers are just too big to be able to do that. So something very significant was needed. So we needed to do it now to get the remaining 8 months of the year in order to bring this into balance. And can I just mention something that Councillor Hyman referred to, Chairman, which was the Section 114 notice. I do make reference to that in paragraph 421. And you know, much is being said in the local government press about 114 notices. And actually, I've described it as being you know, an absolute last resort in the report. And one of the reasons is the very fact that we're having a very constructive debate now between officers and councillors about how we can address this situation is actually proof in itself that a 114 notice would be a last resort, because this is a very robust way of dealing with a very difficult situation. And only if this wasn't happening and the council just couldn't agree on or refused to agree on a package of measures that brought the budget into account, would a Section 151 ever even think about raising a 114 notice?
Thank you. Okay, Jerry, did you want to come back on that point at all?
No, I'm fine for now.
Okay, thank you. Then finally, maybe I could just ask a final question before we move on, and we will come to the exempt session when we will be discussing the very important leisure facilities part of this paper. But can I just ask a question of both Graham and Mark? And I declare something of an interest in that I'm a member of the Property Investment Advisory Board, as is Jerome Davidson. But I just wondered whether we might get some comment on the significant shortfall now in the investments properties target. We've got a £500,000 reduction, which is being estimated, and there's £242,000 of difficulties with investment properties and land charges and so on and so forth. I just, that might be regarded by many of us as something of a great disappointment, and Mark or Graham may like to comment on that.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, it's a tremendous disappointment. The silver lining, if there is one, is that because of our cautious approach to investing, we've by accident rather than design protected ourselves, I think, from some of the fallout from COVID that some of our more aggressive peers are certainly feeling. So you'll know, Mr. Chairman, from the discussions at the Property Investment Advisory Board, there is a great deal of uncertainty as to how the market will react, both in terms of commercial and residential property, whether we have set ourselves too high a target in insisting that our investments return 2% come what may, net, even when the Public Works Loan Board rate has increased and the local yields in certain respects are not even that high gross. So we will, the Investment Advisory Board and the Executive will be reviewing our investment strategy because we have a substantial target to hit, other things being equal. And we have a timeline to build this portfolio when we may have to, I think, look at it a different way and decide what we want the portfolio to look like at the end, rather than building it up piecemeal, and decide that there are some investments that we can invest in now at a lower yield to get the revenue flowing on the basis that the higher yield projects, those, for example, where we self-build on land we already own, will come in on stream eventually, and we have a portfolio return that meets our aspirations, even though individual elements of it might be at the more competitive end. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. So, members of the committee, have you any more questions on this report? Maybe I can ask one final question then, Graham or Mark, and that's the car parks. The car park reduction is significant. We all understand that very few people are using our car parks, although we all hope that that will slowly increase. Could I just ask for a comment on you're expecting a 10% per month increase? Any other thoughts or comments on the likelihood of that? Or is there any more information coming through since this report was published?
Chairman, maybe I can start. So at the moment we're it's looking like, where are we? We're in the second week of July. So it's very, very difficult to tell because we're estimating in there a 50% sort of downturn for July and then gradually recovering. So it's too early for me to give any sort of precision around that. All I can do is say that we will be monitoring every single week in the coming weeks what the position is against the sort of reset budget, and if we're drifting away, then we will have to take the appropriate action, and that might mean that we need to come back to members and say, you know, there's a wider gap opening up here.
Okay, fine, thank you. Now I'm going to bring this to a close unless any other members of the committee wishes to make a comment. Sorry, who was speaking?
Councillor Hyman's hands up. Councillor Mullin.
Jerry, yes, go ahead. And then we've got Stephen, right?
Just on the car park issues, there was a November car park strategy baseline survey done by a company for the council, which is available on our website. And I'm wondering whether the car park strategy has pursued any further, because there are some things in there, obviously, that are relevant to our car park income and what we're doing in the future. So I just wondered whether there was any progress on that strategy.
Okay, and if I could ask Stephen for his question, then we can round it off with Graham. Stephen?
Thank you. It's just a quick comment that I entirely agree that, given it's our largest single source of income, the sheer impossibility of determining how things are going until at least 2 or 3 months have passed means that the estimates put in the 6.6 million net deficit could be hugely flexed by that. And one just hopes, if it's bad, that the government will be coming to our rescue.
Okay, Graham, for final comment on that.
I'll take the one on parking, Chairman.
Oh, sorry, Annie. Right.
It's fine, it's fine. I think Councillor Mullin is right. I think that was he who spoke last. It's really, really difficult at the moment to say what car parking is going to look like over the next 6 months. We don't know how quickly people are going to return to offices, how quickly shops are going to reopen, which classes of shops are going to be open, and are going to drive that parking demand. We have been looking at the strategy. We have been looking at how we manage traffic for air quality reasons and push traffic out to car parks on the outer edges of the towns. But at the moment, it's very difficult to predict any of that or do any of that with any accuracy because of the sheer changes in habits of all of us over the last 6 months. So we will keep an eye on it and we will keep working on that strategy, but it's early days at the moment.
Okay, fine, thank you. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bring that to a close. We will come back on the leisure centres in a separate session after this public session. But I think hopefully, Graham, Mark, you've got some steer from us in terms of our concern on the level of reserves, the need to pursue the government as much as we can to get funding, and the first port of call for that will be restoring some of the reserves. We've had some comments on SANGs, we've had some comments and recommendations on the options side of things, and we've expressed some considerable concern on the subject of car parks. So I think at that point, I'm going to draw a halt to that. And if we may then move on to the next item in the budget, in the meeting, which is item 7, which is the Recovery, Change and Transformation Programme. This is a very important programme. Is it Kelvin who is going to introduce this? Kelvin, over to you.
Yep. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, it is important. The Recovery, Change and Transformation Programme seeks to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the council and its community, and acknowledge the change that has been required to respond to the immediate needs of the organisation and our community as they move towards recovery and the new normal. The RCT programme has 2 main strands. One that focuses on the organisation, the council itself, and that consists of 8 projects, which you'll see on Annex 1, and the wider impact on our community and its economic recovery. Those are the 2 green projects on Appendix 1. It also has 2 phases, one that we've been talking about in detail earlier on this agenda, the immediate financial impact on the organisation against agreed budgets for 2021. But it must be remembered that that's only one objective of the RCT financial project. Phase 2 is what seeks to harness new ways of working, understand the impact on the longer term priorities of the council, and explore what role Waverley can play in supporting its community and economy to recover. All of this work, all of these projects will feed into a review of the medium-term financial plan and a refresh of the corporate strategy. Following on from this meeting and taking on board the committee's comments for executive to consider, O&S, the Overview and Scrutiny Coordinating Board, will look to identify which of the projects go to which committees going forward in the future for greater scrutiny. So this is an overview, but obviously this won't be the last time you see the detailed projects. The overall timescales for these projects are relatively tight, as we are looking to complete the project's objectives by the end of this calendar year so that they can inform the corporate strategy and the medium-term financial plan going forward when we know a little bit more of the impact of COVID-19. And that should be in line with our budget setting process and timetable. Thank you, Chairman. I was asked to keep it quick, so hopefully that's summarised it well.
That's fine. Yasmin is putting her hand up. She's probably going to tell me I didn't take the recommendation from the last item. I was thinking that we would do that after the exempt session, but I guess we ought to do this in public. With the recommendation for the previous item, and we will need to take it again when we do the question of leisure. It's recommended the Value for Money Overview and Scrutiny Committee considers the final position represented in this report, scrutinises the mitigation proposals set out, and passes comments and observations to the executive to consider prior to seeking council approval the revised budget for 2021. I gave a summary of that. Are we content that that goes forward as our recommendation? Could members just wave a hand at me if they are content with that? I think everyone's saying yes to that. So yeah, we've done that, and we'll have to do it again after the exempt session. So apologies, Kelvin. So sorry, just coming then back to item 7. I don't think that we need to spend a great deal of time on this. It's a bit short on detail, if I may say so. Could I just ask the Chair whether the impact and that you're going to stick to your budget for this year? In other words, there's no impact onto the revised budget from anything that you're doing in the 2021 timeframe. So this is really looking forward to the next year and where we go from that. There are no financials here, but what you have on us is a diagram with the change of the structure. You've had a series of meetings with SWOT reviews by committee or by board or by project. So I don't think we have a huge amount to comment on. By the way, I think the recommendation that we need to consider is also one, but we'll come to the recommendation in a moment. So are there any comments from any of the members of the committee?
Hands up from Jerry.
Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a few bits that I picked up reading through the very brief, concise report. As you say, there's not massive detail, but we don't expect that at this stage. Halfway through, I read section 5 on page 31. I think I'm in the right place. It says to us, as we move from the initial emergency state to the start of recovery, obviously that's the case in you can look at it that way, recovering from COVID, but it may not be financial recovery of the economy. We may not be moving in a positive direction over the coming months.
Yeah.
Then under item 6.1, the middle of the 3 paragraphs, says the council has agreed a temporary redeployment policy. I may have missed it if it went past me without me noticing, but I didn't know that we'd done that. So if we could just have a comment on that, whether there's something coming forward. And but really the issue here, I think, Chairman, is when we get to number 8, other options considered, and I think Councillor Gray sort of touched on this under the previous item. It said the council could not continue to operate its full range of services, would have to take drastic cost-cutting measures to balance its budget. It would also bring into question long-term financial resilience of the council. And basically what it's saying is that to continue with that full programme, that wouldn't address those.
Okay.
And I think perhaps those are things which should actually be in the previous item, rather, because of the situation we're in.
Yeah,
that we need to look at drastic cost-cutting items and things right now, rather than sometime in 6 months or a year or two's time.
Okay, got that, Jerry. Thank you. Could I just bring in John Gray? John, did you want to recast your question? I know you wanted to speak to this item as well as the previous one.
Thank you. If I come in very briefly, I think my concern with it, there was a lot of detail on the plan and the project structure, but as we've got to reset the medium-term plan, I've found the question, what do we get out of this, missing from some of those? I think that reading through the individual threats, it looked as though there were more risks associated with some of those projects than opportunities. And I think what we need is some goal for each project that gives us a point in which we're targeting for.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think that's a very reasonable point, but except we are in a very early stage on this, and in a sense, I think it's almost too early to come to this committee because there's so little to bite on.
Could I come back on that?
Yeah.
You've said that, but we're saying in the previous report we're relying on these work streams to solve our medium-term finance plan issues. And we haven't much time left. Thank you for that.
I accept that. I accept that entirely. Jerome, you wanted to make a point? You need to unmute yourself.
That would help.
You're on.
Thank you, Chairman. I probably reflecting your opening remarks. There is a lack of numbers, data to work on. My sense is that what I read is more of an initial feasibility exercise for projects which will need to be set up. What I would ask of the RCT program is that we soon see both a deliverable or a timetable for what's going to be delivered at the end and the savings to be made and what those savings are going to be.
Okay.
And that needs to happen, I believe, soon. Otherwise, there's no point in actually doing any kind of scrutinizing.
Yeah, I agree. And then, Stephen, you have a point, and then I'm going to draw this to a fairly swift conclusion, if I may. So, Stephen?
Yes, I'm just looking at the economic recovery project and the community resilience project. It is early days, but it's got to become much tighter quite quickly. I noticed the reference to smart targets in item 2 of the deliverables, and I wish them well in getting that. We're doing the same thing with the climate change action plan, and we know how difficult that can be. I'd also point out there appears to be a duplication in community resilience. There are 2 SWOT analysis mentions in items 1 and 6. I imagine that the second one is redundant, but unless it's looking at something else. Otherwise, yes, early days, and we look forward very much to seeing the next iteration.
Okay, thank you. So, Kevin, I think we can wrap this up fairly quickly. Our conclusion is that we probably need more in the way of numbers and finances and targets to be able to look at. Number two, John Gray's point is this is pretty damned urgent for the budget for next year, although it's not impacting the budget for this year. When are we going to get real on this subject? And there are one or two other observations as well. You might care to sum up, and then I'll ask Graham or anybody else if they have any final comments. So, Kelvin.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I've taken on board the comments. Obviously, the detail that you're referring to, the SMART targets, will come forward with the specific projects when they go to the scrutiny committee. So finance will obviously definitely be coming here with its SMART targets to achieve the medium-term financial plan objectives. But yes, taken on board, we will take the steer and bring SMART targets back to you.
Okay, thank you. So the recommendation then on page 30, which I'm slightly changing because this is put in wrongly. It's recommended that the committee notes the report and passes observations on the Recovery Transformation Programme and the medium and longer term project objectives of the 10 projects that form the RCT programme. I think that we have done that. Are we content, ladies and gentlemen? Can I have a wave of the hands or nod of the hands?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. That concludes the item 7. Let us then move swiftly on to item 8. Again, my comment here is that the corporate performance report now that we're looking at relates to something which happened 6 months ago. This is the quarter 4 of the last quarter of last year. It's some months. January was it when we had our last meeting, nearly 6 months ago. So this is very late coming to the to this committee. Our concerns should be limited to pages 3 to 9 of the report, or 75 to 81 of the total report, and to pages 114 to 125. Before I do that, is there an officer that wants to make an overall comment on what we're seeing here before I pass to questions?
No, Chairman, the practice we've done in the past is heads of service update on anything that needs to be done and then open it to committee. But if you would like to skip straight to committee questions,
I just feel that the age of this report is something now which has really passed its usefulness, and that we can make. I'm happy to make some observations, but I'll throw it open to the committee members. Do you have any observations on the sections which are relevant to us? Okay, I'm getting a resounding silence. I think that I could make some comments, but I don't think that they are particularly important ones. So I'm going to conclude that for agenda item 8. The recommendation is that the committee considers the performance of the service area and its remit and makes any recommendations. I think that we, in view of the age and the lateness of this, not due to the executive's fault, it's just COVID-19, I don't think it's worthwhile making any further comments. Are we all content with that?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, if anybody's got any particular points that they want to go make, then I would suggest that you go direct to officers, and by all means copy me if you wish. Fine, thank you very much indeed. Which then I guess brings us to, if there is any other business before we go into exempt session, although any other business is not on the agenda. But are there any other points that anybody wishes to raise or make whilst we're in public session? Councillor Potts.
Thank you, Chairman. As a courtesy and given the difficulty at the moment of trying to contact everyone, given that we're working under these emergency measures, I just wanted to let the rest of the committee know that I did raise a number of concerns about an item on the executive agenda last week, which I think some of you may well be aware of. I have spoken to some members of the committee, and in line with the call-in procedure, I plan, with the support of Councillor Mulliner, Dear and Gray, to call that item in, and I shall be talking to Mr. Taylor tomorrow morning to ensure that that meets the right timescales for that item to be called in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Just one thing, Chairman, that isn't, it's more a matter of what isn't in the KPIs, which is that at some point we're going to be having to look at a difficult question of the extent to which our staff and staff in the public sector are working more or less efficiently with obviously there's a great deal of pressure to remote working and to continue with as much remote working as possible in order to minimise problems of transport, everything else, and transmission of the disease in the short to medium term, and obviously longer term, perhaps just might be seen as progress in civilization. I don't know, but we're going to need to address the question of how effective it is, and whether we're going to be, working the same sort of systems that we do at the moment, or going to piecework, or what we're going to be doing, and the extent to which the council's going to be contracting stuff out, and that's going to need to be answered, and we're going to need some sort of performance indicator, or some measurement of how efficient we are at working, and it applies to councillors as well. And I thought that we need to be looking at and asking what sort of measures do we have at the moment, what sort of indications are there, and
Jerry, could I just interrupt? That's not on the agenda, and I take your point, and I'm going to allow that to hang at this particular moment, if you don't mind.
If we can ask whether that we can look at a KPI coming forward for that, some way of measuring it. We do need metrics.
All right, I will leave that with officers, and I'll bring it up at my next meeting with them, if we may.
Very good of you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the public session of this meeting. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So if I can look to Kimberly and to Yasmin as to whether we can then close down the live feed.